Well, the banking sector is different from a lot of sectors because the products they deal in are very complex. Some of them are extremely complex, so complex that only rocket scientists can have a go at valuing them. And the other interesting thing about financial products is they take quite a long time to mature. So that means that it can take some time for the chickens to come home to roost, and you don't quite realise what's happened. As well as being difficult to understand, they're difficult to value. And you need some very complex models to do that. In fact, one of the banks in their report and account says that they use 200 risk pricing models in their systems, and they're very proud of that fact. But just imagine, A, how many people you have to employ for that, and B, how many other people are actually going to understand what's going on. And so what's happened is you had internal people valuing financial products and external agencies such as auditors, credit rating agencies and financial analysts taking what the banks said on face value. And what the banks did was they said, OK, we'll do stress testing. We've got these very sophisticated stress testing models, and we'll say what's going to happen to this particular set of financial products if a particular thing changes. So, for example, interest rates change 1%, what's going to happen? Oh, that's perfectly all right. We understand the system. We know what risk we're bearing, so it's fine. But what people didn't do was they didn't say, OK, what happens when a load of products go wrong at the same time, or what happens when a lot of banks suffer at the same time. That's what we call systemic risk or contagion risk. And we've seen contagion risk in recent months because some of the banks which looked pretty good in the early days were standing back and saying, we're okay, we haven't suffered. And all of a sudden, it's like a domino effect. They're actually going through bad times as well. One of the things G20 is going to talk about is really whether we should have domestic regulation, better domestic regulation and better international regulation. Now, the UK has both had domestic regulation with the Bank of England, the FSA and the Treasury involved, and also there's been international regulation of banks with something called Basel II. And Basel II actually reduced the amount of capital that banks had to set aside, going back to my point about how banks said, well, we understand risk, we've got these models that can test it. So people like Northern Rock and RBS were actually able to reduce the amount of capital they set aside and pay large dividends because they said they'd understood risk. So I think part of the problem has been that it's not that there hasn't been regulation, it's that regulators have been persuaded by the banks that they could understand risk better than the regulators, so it was best to leave it to the banks to do their own self-regulation. And the other thing was there has been, and I think still will be, competition between countries to lure banks to their shores because that brings in revenues, jobs, taxes and so on. And the UK is a particularly good example of that. So it's not really that we need more regulation, we need regulation which works and which is also flexible, because one of the things that bankers are is very well paid and very creative, and they will invent new products and new ways of getting around the system. So, for example, one of the things that's caused problems is offshore vehicles, which the banks had. And what the banks did was they structured those offshore vehicles so that they weren't technically controlled by the bank, so they didn't have to go on their balance sheets. They were so-called off-balance sheet. So banks are actually quite clever about manipulating the system. So the regulators have to regulate, but also be very flexible in changing the regulation to accommodate changes. Well, what's interesting about remuneration is it's been the case for a long time, is that people just look at part of executive remuneration. They just look at the bonus systems and so on, and they don't look at what happens if things go wrong. Because essentially, executive remuneration, the way it's structured at the moment, is what's called a call option. So in other words, you do well when things go well, and when things go badly, you walk away with an extremely large pension. So there's really no downside risk for these executives. It's not the same for shareholders. When shares go down, as they have done in banking shares, you lose 70, 80, 90% of your investment. That's not what's happening to the senior executives of banks. Now, one of the solutions that people are suggesting is to go for 3-year executive remuneration packages. So, in other words, we wait for 3 years, and if the bank's done well over a 3-year period, you get the money. I would argue that that's not really sufficient, because we've had quite a lot of 3-year periods where things have looked really good. And so what will happen is they'll still get their bonuses, but they still have no downside risk. So what I would suggest is that we actually have transparency, as Vince Cable has suggested, where we we expose everybody's salary over a certain level, and he suggested the Prime Minister's salary. Anybody over the Prime Minister's salary should disclose. But they have to disclose everything, and not in the way that they do in lots and lots of pages in the accounts, but actually say, okay, if good times happen, how much will they earn? And if bad times happen and they have to give up, how much will they earn? And people will then be much clearer about the lack of symmetry in executive pay. Well, another thing that's quite interesting is, as I said, these products are very complicated, and so the banks are trying to sell or get the government to guarantee their so-called toxic assets, and these are highly complex, highly difficult to value derivative products. Now, what the government's done is it's in effect what's called sold a put option, so it's taken a fixed amount of money from Lloyds and RBS in return for taking on what is absolutely unspecified amounts of risk, because it's not clear how much we're going to lose, the taxpayers are going to lose on these assets. So it's really quite ironic that we're in a situation which was started by the complexity of financial products, and we're now being forced into contracts which are even more complex and even more risky. I mean, what's happened, as a finance professor, I find it interesting that over the last 20 years, finance has become more and more important. In fact, the UK has become, in a sense, led by finance specialists. But even in companies, you find that you have to understand finance to be able to get on. So, for example, if you're an engineer or an IT specialist, you have to do finance to really make the board-level jobs. And that's because capital structure, dividend policy, leverage, derivatives, all these things are highly complex and you need to understand them. At the OU, we find that our students are actually more and more doing finance courses, even though they don't expect to be specialists in finance, because they really need to understand what's going on in their organisations. For example, banks, one of the problems with the banks was a particular emphasis on a particular financial performance measure, which is called return on equity. And the banks leveraged up, because in that way, by turning over their balance sheets a lot, they could maximise their return on equity. And if people had understood the implications of that particular performance measure a bit better in the boardroom and elsewhere, and commentators, maybe the banks wouldn't have been led onto that perilous path that they were. One of the things about our students is that they study a course on the MBA called Financial Strategy. And one of the ways we structured the course was so that people could actually, at the end of a particular chapter, answer a question that had been puzzling them. So, for example, how should we structure a remuneration policy? Or what's the importance of a pension fund? Or does our cost of capital matter? So, in a sense, people are able, when they've finished the course, to be able to go out and ask difficult questions of finance practitioners. We've also found at the Open University that there's a big rise in interest in investment courses. In fact, we're developing a course called Personal Finance in an Uncertain World, which is a particularly topical title, and that's following on from a very popular course called You and Your Money, which enables people to think about their investments and savings. Because another thing that's happened over the last 10 to 20 years is the transfer of responsibility from the government to individuals to save for their old age, or to worry about, they've had the opportunity, for example, to take a lot of debt on, and not many people have understood the full implications of actually doing that.